Hello, welcome to the Japan Night Pulsar YouTube channel, where I talk about everything to do with the band Japan and the other musicians associated with them. Well, today it's all about Japan, specifically the Quiet Life album. So what I'm going to do is, this is going to be split into I think 3 different parts, this video, because otherwise you'd be talking about 3-hour long video, which I don't think anybody wants to listen to me bang on for 3 hours. But the Quiet Life album and the time the band spent developing the album is really pivotal. It's just absolutely key to where the band came from, where they ended up. It's definitely, in my view, the most important Japan album. It's an essential one that you must have. I'll be shocked if anyone watching this doesn't already have the album, but if you don't, do get it. You'll be in for a treat. But also the amount of changes the band went through during 1979 when they made the album. It really wasn't just about making a new album. It was about reshaping the whole band. The way that they recorded, the way that they wrote songs, the way that they arranged songs, everything changed completely. Right through to when they started to promote Quiet Life, their live shows, their look, everything had changed between Obscure Alternatives in October 78 and when Quiet Life was released in November 79. So I'm going to tell you the full story of that in this video, and then in the next video what we'll do is we'll look at the album itself in detail, track by track. And also the songs that were recorded around about the same time. And in the third video, we're going to look at the enduring impact of Quiet Life, the different versions of the album that came out in different countries, subsequent CD releases, different remasters, all of that kind of thing, because Quiet Life albums had a very long life indeed. So yeah, this video is part 1 of 3. So Quiet Life actually started Japan's 3rd album. The first tentative title they had for it, according to the fan club newsletter sent out to people in January 1979, was actually Aliens. Although I have heard separately that the title was actually Alien, based after the song. So in fact, the track Alien was one of the first things that was written for the album, but it was nothing like the final version. So anyway, in that fan club newsletter, they said that Japan would be starting to work on their 3rd album in February 1979, that it was going to be called Aliens, tentatively, but their producer that they planned to work with at that time was Sandy Pearlman, and they were slated to record the album in San Francisco. So obviously that didn't happen, but it's interesting to look at why Sandy Pearlman might have been considered. Well, Pearlman had recently produced Blue Oyster Cult. He'd worked with Patti Smith and a bunch of others. He's quite a credible producer, but definitely more in the sort of rock vein. And as we know, that isn't the direction that Japan were quite going in at that time. So anyway, we know that didn't happen, even though it was reported, but it might be quite interesting to think about how the 3rd album might have been if they'd gone with a producer with more of a rock background. What was absolutely certain, though, was that Japan were not going to go back to work with Ray Singer. That was definitely not going to happen after their experience making Obscure Alternatives and what happened after that. So I've heard from a few people, and it's been mentioned in passing by former band members, that Japan basically nearly split up after the Obscure Alternatives album and tour. They went through a really rough patch. A few of them had health problems. You know, Rob fractured his leg in an accident. Steve had a near brush with death thanks to appendicitis. And Mick also had a couple of health problems that needed treatment, as did David, has some issues with his throat. So I think the only one that came out unscathed was Richard, who spent the time while the others were recuperating, obviously working with synthesizers and developing his programming skills, which I think you can agree changed greatly between Obscure Alternatives and Quiet Life. So you've got Richard there experimenting with all sorts of kit, and having the means to do so thanks to the success in Japan that was just starting to come through. So yeah, they went through a rough patch. There was some discussion about whether or not they could continue. Now, the solution, which they all agreed on, was that they just could not keep on working in the same way. They needed to wrest control from Hansa and from their manager about what they were doing, and they needed to find a direction that all of them were happy with. And that involved them, you know, using their skills to the fullest. Mick was increasingly interested in playing the saxophone and other woodwind instruments as well as the bass. He'd started playing fretless during the time of Obscure Alternatives and was getting really good at that. So that's something he wanted to integrate into the arrangements. Rob was interested in going in much more of a melodic direction rather than a rock direction. And you can see that in the work that he did from that point on. Richard, I've already mentioned, he was much more interested in creating layered soundscapes and creating atmospheres and feelings and things like that with the synthesizers rather than playing actual tunes, if you like. So that was where he was coming from, and David was right with him in that. There was definitely a sense from David that he needed to change. He couldn't keep singing in the same way because it was destroying his vocal cords. He needed to sing at a pitch and a register that was more comfortable for him. And it just so happened at that time he was really interested in listening to singers that you would call crooners. This is what he mentioned in interviews in 79-80. So Sinatra was a major influence. Brian Ferry, obviously. Bowie was still an influence, but not the Bowie of the early 70s, more the Bowie of the mid to late 70s, who was also exploring different ranges in his voice. So you had that. And I haven't mentioned Steve, but Steve, of course, was just a solid member of the band who could do anything. It's been said more than once that Steve might be the most talented member of Japan in terms of really being solid with his instrument from day one. And I think you can tell that from all of the Japan albums. Steve is incredible. Plus, Steve also was starting to play a bit of keyboards. He would play percussion. He could turn his hand pretty much to anything. Same with David as well. So a key change that happened, obviously you're looking at the earliest songs that were developed. There was European Sun, that was inspired by their tour in the USA in October 78. There was initial attempts made at arranging the song around about December, January 78. And that's the sort of arrangement that you could hear on the Japanese tour on bootlegs. So it brought in the sequences, but it still had a guitar line. It still had kind of sensibility of Obscure Alternatives about it in its earliest version. Other songs that were written around that time and that were slated for the third album were Fall in Love with Me, Halloween, and also Alien, but I'll come back to that in a minute. So Halloween and Fall in Love with Me, they didn't change massively from their initial rehearsals through to when they were finally recorded for the Quiet Life album. But what changed was the arrangement, the amount of synthesizers that were involved, and the kind of the mixing process, so that they have in their final versions, as we know, they have this incredible sense of space, power, but you know, style, and it's kind of like a certain je ne sais quoi, I can't say, but it's very much their own thing, where they're clearly, you could imagine them done in the style of Obscure Alternatives, but they wouldn't be as great as they are on Quiet Life, with all of that layering, mixing and arrangement going on. But I digress. So those were the early songs. Alien was a completely different number. It had different lyrics. It had a different structure. It was more like a kind of a slow growing song, a little bit like Obscure Alternatives maybe, and then building up to a bit more of a crescendo. So that was the initial Alien song, but it got changed completely before it was finally recorded later in 79. So those were the songs you had. They were also working on a cover of Heartbreaker by the Rolling Stones, which is something that they'd been playing live since spring 78, and that was still being considered potentially for the album, although that never happened. I don't know if an actual full recording exists. We're not sure, but it definitely exists from live recordings. So then you had the situation where they didn't go and record that album. They just did some rehearsals and things, and obviously they rehearsed for the Japanese tour and also the European tour that took place immediately after the Japanese tour, the New Rising Sound tour. And so the Japanese tour was really pivotal. They obviously needed to play their older material. They didn't significantly rearrange anything. They kept to the sound of Obscure Alternatives for the live shows in the spring of '79. The only exception was European Sun, which is the new addition to the set. And as has been shown on, there's videos from TV appearances and also a live recording from FM. It was pretty different to the final version that the band put together a bit later in the year. It started off with the sequencer getting faster and faster, and then the instrumentation came in. Mixed bass line was a bit different. The guitar line didn't end up on the final recorded version, or at least it was buried in the mix. And also the whole vocal arrangement was quite different from the final version. So it's kind of like a in-between, if you like. The other thing that was slightly new in the set was that they added some instrumentation to the ballad intro to Suburban Berlin. So that became almost more of its own little mini track, as opposed to the a cappella opening that was used during British dates on previous tours. So obviously the Japanese tour continued on through the first half of March '79, and then the band immediately went to Los Angeles to record Life in Tokyo with Giorgio Moroder, which is again another pivotal moment. So the original suggestion had been to record European Sun, and that was during the Japanese tour. David was on camera. There's video on this channel actually with an interview where he says that it's likely to be the new single, and they also started to refer to the third album as European Sun, possibly because that was a song they were playing live in Japan, and it was a way to kind of gauge a bit of interest, I suppose. So that was the intention, to record European Sun as the next song. But obviously, as we know, Giorgio Moroder had other ideas, and he presented the band with a demo that he'd produced for the soundtrack to a film called Foxes. And I'll play you a little clip of that here, if the copyright gods allow me, and it's going to be a brief clip. So then the Foxes was then revised by David when Giorgio went out for a break, and he created the lyrics for Life in Tokyo and rearranged the structure of the song to the one that we all know now. So Tokyo was recorded incredibly quickly, and it was released within weeks. The Hansa were really excited about it. They were very up for Japan working with Giorgio Moroder, because obviously he'd had success for the label before with different artists, and it was the kind of single that they felt they could market, which they did so as disco rock in the USA. Obviously Life in Tokyo got pretty wide release. Unfortunately it wasn't a big hit anywhere, but it did, I believe, raise the profile of Japan in various countries, and obviously since it first came out, it became a really well-loved track, particularly as the music scene develops into 1980. So yeah, Life in Tokyo, I would consider that to be a success for the band. Next thing up was their New Rising Sound tour, which they did. That was mainly in Germany and the Netherlands, finishing off on April the 12th in London for a show at the Rainbow, the first big headlining show. And as I've spoken about on previous videos, really important gig. They had members of other bands in attendance, for example, Duran Duran, and it was the first time they'd played European Sun, Halloween, and also Live in Tokyo, Live in London. So it was kind of, the sound had developed even more during the European tour. So European Sun for the first time had its initial drum break, which we're all familiar with from the single. Life in Tokyo pretty much sounded like the 12-inch version. They even had the backing singers at the Rainbow as well. And Halloween sounds very close to the final album version, just like a rough take, if you like. But the whole song was there, the whole arrangement was there. And you could tell that that was going to be a major, strong song as it went forward. So then you get to the rest of April, May, and what Japan do is they select John Punter as their producer of choice. There was talk about them doing a whole album with Moroder, but that wasn't something that they wanted to do. John Punter was their choice and they stuck to it. Unfortunately, he wasn't available when Japan wanted to record, which was in the late spring. So they agreed to wait for John. In the meantime, they went into the studio to record the final versions of European Sun and also All Tomorrow's Parties. Now, European Sun, this initial recorded version, it was actually presented to Hansa for single release, but they decided to wait until the album was going to come out. So the initial version of European Sun that was recorded is strangely very close to the 1981 remix by Steve Nye. When John Punter did his final mix that was released in various countries in sort of 1980, he really smoothed it out and made it much more disco, whereas the original mix is like Steve Nye's 12-inch mix. The sequences are much more harder sounding, the drum has got a bit more crash to it, and mixed bass is more to the fore. So it's very interesting to hear that with the Steve Nye remix, they kind of went back to their original vision for the song. But honestly, if you've got 12-inch version of European Sun, you've pretty much got that original. I think the only thing that Nye did was, I think he may have got Mick to overdub the bass again, because the bass sounds a little bit different. And the bass is more like Mick in 81, 82. And there's also a bit more emphasis on the drums. There's a bit more, I don't know how you put it, some kind of reverb on the drums in the remix. But it's still got that middle section with the extra synthesizers in it. And it's got the full ending with David singing a couple of extra refrains and that kind of thing. So yeah, that's a very interesting thing I noticed. But it means all those years I was wondering what the original version of European Sun was going to be like, and then it was a bit underwhelmed because it's just like the 1982 12-inch version. Okay, fine. All Tomorrow's Parties, interestingly, the original mix of that before John Punter got his hands on it, very, very close. It's like 90% the same as the version that's on the Quiet Life album. In terms of arrangement, the fading in, all of that is exactly the same. I just think that John Punter put a bit of extra production polish on it for the final Quiet Life album. But really, if you listen to them back to back, unless you knew the song inside out, you wouldn't really notice that many differences. So it's fair to say that Japan nailed it on their first try with All Tomorrow's Parties, and that is pretty much what you get on the Quiet Life album. Definitely Punter didn't do as much to All Tomorrow's Parties as he had done to European Sun, which was shelved. So then you get, Poor European Sun. It was, as I say, meant to be a single in 1979 initially, presented to Hansa by the band. Then the Quiet Life album got recorded over the summer, and a couple more songs were written, that kind of thing. And the Quiet Life title track had some similarities to European Sun in terms of arrangement, but the band all agreed it was a much stronger song than European Sun. So European Sun got dropped from the Quiet Life album, and it was just going to be used as a potential single or B-side a bit later on down the line. So it was finished off by John Punter, but it was shelved and taken off the album. And I'll talk more about the individual album tracks in the next video, which will be a track-by-track analysis of all the songs. But yeah, so you've got Punter was available by late summer. They went into Air Studios and recorded the album. One of the last things to happen was that Anne Odell added the strings to In Vogue and The Other Side of Life. And then the final track recorded was A Foreign Place, which later became a B-side. At one point it was considered for the album. It was recorded during the album sessions. It wasn't initially intended to be a B-side, but that's what happened to that song. And I'll talk more about that, A Foreign Place, in a future video, because it's had a bit of an afterlife as well, that song. So September 79, the album was getting finished off and mixed. It took a while to mix. Everyone enjoyed the process by all accounts. It was the time when the band, with their new approach, their fresh approach, were all getting on really well. They were enjoying each other's company. They were enjoying the creative process at putting together an album they were genuinely all proud of. And yeah, it was probably the peak period for Japan as a 5-piece, was during that Quiet Life period, from the time when they started working on it right through to after its release and the subsequent Quiet Life tour. It was their, relationships, they were all getting on fine. Everyone knew their place in the band. Everyone had an important part to play. Everyone was valued and respected equally. And it was really them against the world. And they were doing exactly what they wanted to do. Hansa did support them. It's a bit later on that Hansa got a little bit cheesed off. I think Hansa were convinced that it would be a hit, so they put an awful lot into the promotion of the album when it came out. But unfortunately, nothing really stuck. It did get into the UK charts, but at the lower end. I think Hansa would have preferred it was in the top 20 rather than the sort of top 60. And they hadn't managed to repeat the success that they had with the Adolescent Sex single in Europe, for example. Of course, it did well in Japan, the country, but that was, that was the foregone conclusion almost, because by that point Japan were just hugely popular there. However, they were increasing in popularity in the UK as well, and they started to sell many more tickets to their gigs that they did in London, and the fan response was really strong. The clubs that became New Romantic clubs were all starting up around that time, and Life in Tokyo and Quiet Life became absolute staples of the lineup. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself now. A bit more information from the fan club magazines. So the Quiet Life album came out in November 79 in Canada and Japan, and it was slated for release in Europe and the UK in January 1980. Interestingly, on some sleeves, they're of course not the one that I've got in front of me now, it actually calls it a 1980 release, and I think that was kind of a deliberate thing. They wanted to release it in 1980, not 1979, so that it would be seen as looking forward and not potentially seen as last year's thing. But I can only speculate on that, because who knows the mysteries of the Hansa promotional department. Anyway, fan club magazines. Interesting, the fan club newsletters often told us about things that didn't actually happen or were delayed in some way, shape or form. So this is a good example of it. So around about Christmas 79, there was supposed to be an EP out. So it was going to comprise of a single version of All Tomorrow's Parties, which later came out on Assemblage, European Sun, and A Foreign Place, like a 3-track single. But Hansa, unfortunately, were not convinced. So they asked Japan if they could potentially go into the studio and record something else, another cover version that might be a bigger hit than All Tomorrow's Parties. I find that crazy. I mean, in Japan, they'd released Quiet Life as a single A-side, and that had done well and helped promote the album. Why didn't they just release Quiet Life? Get it out the gate in 1980. Why wasn't that an A-side? Why wasn't that plugged? I just can't fathom it out at all. It's such a strong song. And I think it was a mistake on Hansa's part, a mistake on the band's part, whoever made the decision to delay putting out a single until a couple of months later and then make it a Second That Emotion. And the best that they could come up with to promote Second That Emotion was that David was voted the most beautiful man in the world, which he kind of was in Music Life magazine. I think they called the award Mr. Valentine or something like that. But yeah, I just think it beggars belief. Obviously, Japan believe in Second That Emotion. Obviously, it did become a big hit a couple of years later, but I just think it was the wrong timing. Japan could have sounded like they were from the future if they'd released, Quiet Life as a single in early 1980. I believe, with everything that was going on in the world of synth and new wave and all of the rest, they could have been ahead of the curve instead of a year later being recognised as being ahead of the curve and everyone listening to songs from a year earlier as they started to be reissued. Yeah, just one of those strange decisions, strange mysteries. But there you go, there you have it. So I Second That Emotion, didn't do that well. In the UK, European Sun didn't get released again, so it was still sitting on the shelf. It did come out as the B-side of Second That Emotion in Japan, and it came out on the Canadian 5-track EP, which was important to Canada because it kind of mopped up some things that had not been available in that country before. And Japan did have some popularity in Canada, so it was a fair release. So there you go. I mean, it's quite important to consider how Quiet Life did change the band, and it really was through that whole process of them developing their sound, their image and everything else. So I hadn't really talked about the image much, but as you'll have noticed, they did completely change between 78 and 79 and again in 1980. So they made a conscious decision to try and have a new, more sophisticated image to fit with the new, more sophisticated music that they were planning to make. So first of all, Steve, Mick and David had their hair cut at Mainline into new shorter cuts, although not so much shorter. And then Rob and Rich also had haircuts as well. They just started wearing suits and ties, generally smartened up their image from being a little bit grungy, a little bit messy. They'd moved away from that sort of New York Dolls influence into much more a kind of sophisticated, you could say Roxy Music influence, because they were wearing things by Anthony Price as well and that kind of thing. But it was their own sense of sophistication. And, David still had certain key things that he wore, like the bangles, for example. And Mick was still dressing in his own way. He was smart, but smart on his own terms. And I think you can tell that with all of the band, actually. They were able to dress much more as they wanted to, things that they were really comfortable in, but things that still showed them off as at their best. And this is something that came out in the press as well. Japan were always asked about their makeup. It never ended. Their makeup, their looks, their clothes. It almost seemed to be a major obsession, particularly among European journalists, to talk about this. But they definitely toned it down, but at the same time turning it up again with a couple of photo sessions. So yeah, just before the Quiet Life album came out, they went to one session with David Bailey, and they had another session with Patrick Litchfield. And in both of those sessions, they were heavily made up. They had the haircut again, but dyed brighter colours. And yeah, they're pretty full-on photo sessions, but they got a lot of mileage out of them. Hansa used those photos for a range of different press adverts around the time that Quiet Life came out and to promote live gigs. They didn't just use one photo, they actually used multiple different photos in different magazines to sort of maximise the impact and use the photos from the sessions. You could say they were highly successful. And it did promote that Japan had a new image. But it was strange as well because it had changed again since the Quiet Life album had come out. Because these pictures were taken in the first half of 1979, round about, I don't know, like April, May. These were all shot. And in fact, some members of the fan club were actually sent out like early photocopied versions of the album designed so that they could see what it was like early, get a preview months ahead. It seems strange to think about that now, that they were thinking about the third album sleeve, you know, basically 6 to 8 months before it was released. But there you go. And as you can see, the Quiet Life sleeve itself is actually absolutely a thing of beauty. You've got David on the front there, Mick on the back, of course, in a similar pose but mirrored, and then sandwiched between, you've got Richard, Rob and Steve. And this sleeve contains full credits. Yeah, it's just a magnificent sleeve, an absolute classic, hugely influential, I think, in terms of fashion and style for quite a long period, way past the time when the photos were taken. People were dressing like this, people had the haircut like this. Yeah, major inspiration for a lot of bands at that time. Completely, the music, the sound, the image, it all came together and coalesced into something of great significance. And it's just a great, fun, enjoyable album as well, whichever way you want to take it. It's really good for repeat listens. I can still listen to the album now and find something new in the mix because it's so layered and so fascinating. But I'll get more into that in the next video, in which I will talk about how Quiet Life was recorded, what was involved, the development of the songs, and we'll go through the whole thing track by track. So I hope you enjoyed that video, and will continue to follow me to learn even more about the Quiet Life album. As I say, there'll be definitely 2 more videos. The next one will look at the songs in detail, and the one after will look at the different releases of Quiet Life, which are the best, which are not so good, different formats it's come out on, all the weird different track listings on various foreign cassettes and things like that, and where there were some differences or additions going right up to the sort of 2021 remastered reissue, which is possibly the best version, but possibly not. We will discuss it in the future. Anyway, everyone, hope you have a great weekend. Hope you have a great week. So you all take care, and I will see you again soon.